Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. We always love to hear what topics you want us to dig into, and lately, analogies have been at the top of the list.
Yeah, it seems like everybody wants to know more about them.
Exactly. Some of you are prepping for presentations, some are trying to win arguments, but the common thread is you want to understand how analogies work, why they're so darn effective, and how to use them like a pro.
Well, you came to the right place. We've got a mountain of sources here. Definitions, types of analogies, even warnings about potential pitfalls.
Oh yeah, I have to admit, before we got into all this, I sort of thought analogies were just a fancy way of saying one thing's like another.
Right, that's kind of the basic idea most people have.
But these sources suggest it's a lot more complex than that, right? Like, there's some serious cognitive science going on when we use analogies.
Absolutely. Analogies are way more than just figures of speech.
Okay, so break it down for us. Why are they so powerful? Well, they tap into how our brains make sense of the world. Instead of starting from scratch with every new concept, we use analogies to connect new information to stuff we already know.
So it's like our brains are taking a shortcut.
Exactly. Our brains are always trying to conserve energy, and analogies help reduce that cognitive load.
So instead of racking our brains trying to figure out some abstract idea,
We can grasp it way quicker by relating it to something we're already familiar with.
that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of familiar, who hasn't heard that classic line, life is like a box of chocolates?
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Even if you've never seen the movie, you get the gist, right?
Right. Life is full of surprises. You never know what you're going to get.
And it's such a simple analogy, but it really drives home that complex idea that life is unpredictable.
And that's the beauty of it. It's relatable and memorable. It evokes emotions, sensory experiences. It's way more impactful than just a dry definition.
So you're saying analogies aren't just about making things easier to understand, they also make them stick?
Precisely. That vivid imagery, the emotional resonance, it helps solidify those ideas in our minds. It's a crucial part of learning and remembering.
And something that surprised me was that there are actually different types of analogies.
No, there are definitely a few different flavors.
It's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. While the core function is the same, connecting the known to the unknown, there are different ways to do it.
So, what are some examples?
Well, you've got your metaphorical analogies, like that life is a box of chocolates we just talked about.
Right, that one's all about abstract qualities, emotions.
Exactly. They can be really powerful for persuasion, for adding depth to language.
Makes sense. And then there are those A is to B as C is to D analogies.
Right, yes, those are proportional analogies.
I always kind of like those, like little puzzles to solve.
They are a bit like puzzles. They highlight relationships between pairs of things.
So it's not just about comparing things directly, it's about figuring out how those things relate to each other.
Exactly. It makes you map those relationships, make inferences, and that's great for building logical thinking skills.
Okay, that makes sense. Then there are those visuals, like charts and diagrams.
Ah, yes, visual analogy.
Even if you're not a visual learner, those things can really help you grasp an idea.
Oh, absolutely. They help us create mental models. They turn abstract ideas into something we can actually see in our minds.
So we've got metaphorical, proportional, visual. Are there any other types we should know about?
Well, we've got verbal analogies too, and these are everywhere in our everyday language. Think of phrases like raining cats and dogs.
Oh, yeah, or busy as a bee. I use that one all the time.
See, those metaphors are so common we don't even think of them as analogies anymore. They're just how we communicate.
Wow, so it's like analogies are shaping how we think and talk without us even realizing it.
You got it. They're deeply embedded in our language and thought processes. Hard to imagine communicating without them.
It's kind of blown my mind a little bit. So we've covered some basic types, but beyond making things easier to grasp and remember, what are some other benefits of using analogies?
Well, there's a bunch of cognitive advantages. For one, they can help us solve problems.
Oh, really? How so?
By applying knowledge from one area to another, like let's say you're struggling with a challenge at work.
Okay, been there.
You could try to think of an analogy from a completely different part of your life, like a hobby or a sport, to see if that gives you any insights.
So it's like using what you know in one area to shed light on a problem in a totally different area.
Exactly. That's analogical reasoning in action. It's a great way to break out of those ruts and find creative solutions.
I like the analogies as creativity boosters. What else?
They could also help us make decisions
Oh, how's that?
by providing a framework for evaluating options. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by a problem, an analogy can help simplify those choices and weigh the potential outcomes.
So it's like having a mental model to guide our decision making.
You got it. And that's especially helpful when we're dealing with uncertainty or unfamiliar situations.
Okay, this is all making a lot of sense. But I gotta ask, are there any downsides to using analogies? Can they ever lead us astray?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something the sources caution against.
Because they can be so powerful, right?
Exactly. They have incredible power for understanding and communication, but they also have limitations.
Look what?
One of the biggest pitfalls is oversimplification.
So an analogy might make something seem too easy or straightforward when the reality is much more complicated.
Precisely. And that can lead to misunderstandings or even bad decisions if we rely too heavily on a flawed analogy.
Oh, I can see that happening. It's like assuming that just because two things are similar in some ways, they must be similar in all ways.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in. We need to be able to evaluate the validity of an analogy, see if the comparison really holds up.
So it's not just about understanding the analogy, it's about questioning it too.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of potential biases and limitations and be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Analogies are powerful tools, but like any tool, they need to be used responsibly.
Well said. That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's not just about how analogies work, it's about their implications and potential impact.
Right. We need to use this power wisely. Now, I'm curious about how analogies are used in different fields. I mean, beyond everyday conversations, where else do we see them?
That's a fantastic question, and the sources really get into that. They pop up everywhere: education, science, law, politics, you name it.
Okay, I am definitely ready to hear more about that. Okay, so you're telling me analogies are everywhere. Where should we even start?
Yeah. Education's probably the most obvious, right?
Yeah, I can see that. Teachers using them to explain tough concepts to kids.
It's more than just simplifying things, though.
Oh, how so?
Good teachers, they don't just pick any old analogies. They choose ones that connect to what their students already know, their experiences.
Ah, that makes sense. Build those bridges from familiar to unfamiliar.
Exactly. And if the student doesn't have that background knowledge,
Then analogy's not going to work, might even confuse them more.
exactly. And that brings up a big point about analogies in general context is key.
Makes sense. Okay, so education, we got that. What about those other fields you mentioned, like science and politics? I have a harder time picturing it.
Well, in science, they're not just for explaining stuff to the public.
Really? They use them for actual research?
Oh, yeah, for guiding research, developing hypotheses, all sorts of things.
I would never have thought of that.
Scientists use analogies to connect things that seem totally different at first glance.
And that can lead to new ideas, right?
Absolutely. It can spark those aha moments that lead to groundbreaking discoveries.
So it's not just explaining things after the fact, they're using analogies to drive the scientific process itself.
That's exactly it. A good example is that classic analogy of the atom as a solar system.
Oh yeah, with the electrons orbiting the nucleus like planets.
Right. That helped scientists visualize the atom way back when they couldn't actually see it.
Like using an analogy to create a mental model for something beyond our perception.
Exactly. And they still use them today for all sorts of complex concepts, from tiny particles to the entire universe.
Mind-blowing. Okay, so what about politics? How do they use analogies?
Think about how politicians try to explain complicated policies or sway public opinion.
Yeah, they're always trying to simplify things, make it sound relatable.
Exactly. They use those simple, relatable comparisons to connect with voters, make abstract issues seem more concrete.
I've definitely heard those sound bites like, cutting taxes is like putting money back in your pocket.
There you go. Or government regulation is like strangling small businesses.
Yeah, those kind of catchy phrases.
They're designed to be catchy. It's all about persuasion, framing an issue a certain way, appealing to people's values.
But that can be dangerous, right? What if the analogy is misleading?
That's the big danger. And it brings us back to critical thinking.
Because we're bombarded with analogies, especially in politics.
Right. We need to be able to evaluate if those comparisons actually hold up. Are they based on facts, or are they just trying to manipulate us?
So we need those analogy detectors you talked about.
We do, to make sure we're not being swayed by bad logic or emotional appeals. Understanding the types of analogies, their strengths and weaknesses, that's what makes us better critical thinkers.
And are more informed citizens.
Absolutely. It's not just about appreciating a clever analogy. It's about understanding how they can be used or misused to shape how we see the world.
Wow. Yeah, that's deep. So it's not just about understanding analogies, it's about understanding their impact.
Exactly. And that awareness is crucial in today's world, where everyone is shouting their opinions at us.
Right? We got to sift through the noise, figure out the logic, make good decisions based on facts, not just catchy phrases.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's not just about being savvy consumers of analogies, it's also about being responsible creators of them.
You mean when WE use analogies, we got to make sure they're accurate and fair?
That's right. And it goes beyond just getting the facts straight. It's also thinking about the impact our analogies might have.
How people might interpret them, if they might reinforce harmful stereotypes, things like that.
Exactly. It's an ethical dimension to using analogies well.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that before.
It's something we often forget, but our words have power. We shape our own understanding and the understanding of others.
That's a really important reminder. So we've covered education, science, politics. Are there any other areas where analogies are big players?
Oh, tons. Law, business, art, literature. Think about lawyers, how they use analogies to argue their cases.
Oh, yeah, drawing those parallels between different situations.
Right, like connecting the dots between different legal cases or scenarios to make their point.
In business, I bet they use them to explain financial stuff.
Oh, all the time. Or to pitch new ideas to investors.
Make something complex or unfamiliar seem more down to earth.
Exactly. And then in art and literature, analogies create imagery, evoke emotions, help us understand the human experience.
So they're everywhere, in every part of how we communicate and understand the world.
They really are. And the more we learn about them, the more we appreciate their power and how much they're a part of our lives.
It's like opening up a whole new dimension of understanding, not just about the world, but about how our minds work.
And that's what's so cool about this deep dive. It's a journey of discovery, not just about analogies, but about learning, thinking, communicating.
I couldn't agree more. So we've talked a lot about the good stuff, but I'm still wondering, are there any areas where analogies just aren't the best tool for the job? Like, are there times when they might do more harm than good?
That's a great question, and it's important to remember that analogies are simplifications of complex ideas. We have to acknowledge their limitations.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about those limitations.
Okay.
I'm all ears. Tell me about those limitations.
Well, if we over-rely on analogies without thinking about those limitations, that's when we can get into trouble.
Okay, what kind of trouble are we talking about here?
For one, they can sometimes mask the nuances of a situation.
So they make things seem simpler than they really are.
Right, and that can lead to oversimplification, misinterpretations. Yeah.
So it's like an analogy can help explain something, but if we're not careful, it could also hide important details.
Exactly. We might jump to the wrong conclusions.
Because we're only seeing part of the picture.
That's it. And that's why it all comes back to critical thinking.
We got to use our brains.
We do. Recognize that an analogy is just a tool.
Right, like any tool, you can use it the right way or the wrong way.
And it's up to you as to figure out if the comparison is valid. You know, check for biases, make sure we're not stretching the analogy too far.
Don't want to force it where it doesn't belong.
Exactly. So, yeah, we can be misled by bad analogies.
But on the flip side, can we also be, like, empowered by good ones?
Absolutely. Good analogies, they don't just help us understand things better.
They can do more than that.
Oh, yeah. They can spark creativity, lead to new innovations, even drive social change.
Wow, really? Got any examples of that?
Think about the civil rights movement. All those powerful analogies they used.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Comparing segregation to a wall or a disease.
Right. Really powerful imagery.
That helped people see the injustice, you know, and it motivated them to fight for change.
Like it gave them a shared understanding of the problem and inspired them to act.
Exactly. That's just one example of how analogies can have a huge impact on society.
They shape how we see things, what we value, what we believe in.
They really do. It's pretty amazing.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I get analogies on a whole new level now.
Me too. It's crazy how these little figures of speech can have such a big impact on how we think and learn and talk to each other.
They're not just something you learn in English class. They're everywhere.
They are. They're fundamental to how we make sense of the world.
And the more we understand about them, the better we can use them, right?
Exactly. Effectively and responsibly.
Love it. So as we wrap up here, what's like one key piece of advice you'd give to someone who wants to become an analogy master?
I'd say cultivate curiosity. Pay attention to analogies everywhere you find them in books, conversations, the news.
Like become an analogy detective.
Yeah. Analyze how they're built, see if they hold up, think about their impact.
So it's like a constant learning process, always getting better at using analogies and spotting the bad ones.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to try making your own.
That's a good one. putting what we've learned into practice.
It's a great way to test if you really understand something, and it helps you find creative ways to explain your ideas to other people.
I love that challenge. So to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of analogies.
Hope you had fun.
We sure did. And we hope you've learned a thing or two about how powerful these little tools can be.
Use them wisely, folks.
Until next time, keep those analogies flowing.